Now, we're delighted today to be joined by Nick Gulliver, who is Director of Advocacy at the Economics and Mutuality Alliance, where he leads the Business versus Loneliness campaign in partnership with the University of Manchester. We're also joined by Emmaline Rogers, who leads delivery of HEINEKEN's Brew a Better World sustainability strategy, bringing experience across corporate affairs, sustainability, and social impact. We also have Amy Perrin, OBE, founder of Marmalade Trust and a recognised national expert on loneliness policy and social connection, and Pippa Moyle, founder and CEO of City Girl Network, one of the UK's largest women's communities focused on connection, belonging and empowerment. So listen, we don't have very long today and we're super grateful for you joining us. So a tiny quick bit of housekeeping before we get into this. Please feel free to use the chat function throughout the session to submit any questions for the panel today. We have had some questions already submitted and we'll use those to navigate the beginning of this discussion. And we're going to try to cover as many of those questions as possible live. However, if we need to, we'll follow up afterwards on anything we don't get time to address. As you've already heard, the webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the event. So if you haven't already done so, you might want to switch to speaker view for the most optimum viewing experience. So if you click the top right-hand corner of your screen and select speaker view, that should give you a great way for everything to be seen. So with that, let's get started. So first question up really today is a simple one, I suppose, but actually potentially quite a complicated one. And it's the one question I'm really interested in hearing our panel's answer to. And that is this: how is loneliness actually showing up in workplaces? And what do you think organizations are still getting wrong about loneliness in the workplace? And why do you think that might be? Now, it seems sensible to go directly to Emmaline this morning because having introduced you, HEINEKEN have got this whole sort of campaign around loneliness. So to you first, Emmaline.
Thanks, Jez. And yeah, I'm delighted to be able to answer this question from an organisational point of view. I suppose, first of all, what organisations are getting wrong and how is it showing up? I mean, an understanding about loneliness is key. So, and loneliness shows up in many different ways for different people. And also an understanding that being alone is not the same as the experience of loneliness. So, number one is the understanding, and we also find ourselves in a perfect storm where there's complex issues that may affect our experience of loneliness, cost of living crisis, attention economy, and the many different things that are happening in lives at the moment. But loneliness isn't a marginal issue. And borrowing from Amy and the Marmalade Trust brilliant report on Monday that was launched, 80% of UK adults experience loneliness. So understanding that it's not a marginal issue, right? We're all experiencing it in different ways. And the fact that loneliness is both a symptom and a cause. So that's how we can come from a place of putting the right actions in place for our colleagues in the workplace. And secondly, actually to your point, Jez, HEINEKEN's focus is not about loneliness as a campaign. We've been working in this space for a decade, and obviously more recently with the Marmalade Trust since 2023. So for exactly that reason, we need to not treat loneliness as an annual campaign and for it to feel tokenistic and potentially, another thing on someone's to-do list. We want to move to a place where the action is more meaningful and it's embedded in the everyday actions that we can all take in the workplace that influence how people experience work. And by that, it's then embedded. It doesn't feel like a campaign. It's, we're walking the talk when we talk about, the work we're doing on loneliness. And importantly, it feels more meaningful. So we unlock an opportunity for colleagues to feel empowered to be part of. Everybody's got a role to play in alleviating loneliness in the workplace.
Sure. Thank you, Emmaline, for the correction. I appreciate that. And it's a really important one to make, actually. Because we don't think about loneliness, I don't think, broadly as a society. Like to your point, in that word, actually it shows up in all sorts of different ways. Loneliness is almost the pebble in the pond, and we focus on the ripples of the causes of it. For those of you that have just joined us, we're talking about how loneliness shows up in the workplace. what our panel think organisations are still getting wrong about that and why they think that might be. Nick, over to you for your thoughts on this, please.
No, I absolutely agree with what's been said. And I think actually loneliness is quite difficult to spot sometimes because it hides behind normal workplace behaviour. Stereotypically, we think of someone sitting alone, withdrawn from colleagues, but in reality, lonely employees may be attending meetings, collaborating and performing well. But internally, they might feel disconnected, unsupported or unheard. The research highlights experiences such as feeling invisible, lacking meaningful support, struggling through transitions, or feeling nobody checks in on their well-being. And I think organizations tend to measure engagement, productivity, well-being, but they rarely measure loneliness directly. And as a result, they often only notice the consequences, like you said, the ripples rather than the pebble. They see stress, reduced performance, weaker collaboration, absenteeism, turnover, but maybe loneliness could be one of the driving factors behind those things.
That's a really interesting point. And that's a typical human trait that we tend to focus on the noisy, messy stuff afterwards and not necessarily the cause. We're very consequence led. Pippa, you're CEO and founder of City Girl Network, which is now, I'm reliably informed, the UK's largest women's community focused on connection, belonging and empowerment. So you clearly have a lot of involvement in this. I'm interested to come to you next for your answer.
Yes, so we reach over 250,000 women all over the UK, across 27 different locations as well. So obviously belonging is a huge part of it. I think the way I always like to look at things is in a sort of a positive light, in a sense that belonging is ultimately the antidote to loneliness. So just really echoing what Emmaline and Nick have said, loneliness does show up in sort of these micro moments. So, things like, I don't really feel like I belong where I work, and I don't really get on with my manager very well, and a lot of the time that's because of a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. I work with many professional women who come to us because they feel lonely and disconnected, and one of the big things that we really do is keep people within their workplace, because we help them to belong where they are in their communities and in their cities. So I think that I've been doing this for 10 years. So that's since 2016, over the pandemic and into the sort of flexible working, hybrid working. So it's been quite an interesting shift from that 2016 to now. And, you hear a lot in the news about flexible working. Is that helping loneliness? Is it not? But the reality is that I think what has happened is that companies have shifted to a whole new way of working, but haven't really considered that belonging sense and how they're going to start, especially in remote working is an easy one to say. How are you going to help your new starters, especially if they are, first or second job and quite young, or returning to work after maternity is also a very, very big issue, to help you feel like you belong in your workplace. And I think really taking that moment to consider, how are the ways that they do belong. So for example, with flexible working, if you're remotely working, they are going to find their sense of human connection and belonging through yoga classes and things like that. So is there a way that you can work in that, an hour every week, they're allowed that kind of personal connection time in their own cities, if that's going to help? Or of course, booking in coffees and things like that to be able to talk to other members of staff and to not make them feel like they're wasting time, because that's the other issue. Is there is a sense of, we've got loads and loads of work to do, this is really stressful, and you're just spending your time having coffees. But the reality is that when you are meeting your other colleagues and you are taking the time to belong, you're going to get the very, very, very best out of that person, because they feel safe enough and confident enough to be able to share ideas and collaborate. So actually, ultimately, in the end, you're going to get a much clearer workforce. And the big issue we found is, typically speaking, people I work with, they only stay in the job for about 18 months. That's quite common, and they've left because they didn't feel like they fit in there, and ultimately that's saying that they don't belong there. So yeah, it's been, particularly since 2020, I've personally in the City Girl Network have noticed that real rise in loneliness in the workplace, because you're shifting too quickly in how you're working and you're not considering that human connection element.
Sure. Thank you. What a great answer. What's fascinating, I'm a big proponent of humans being humans, of us working together as one unit. And the less other we can create, the better we work together and the more understanding we are. But your point's really interesting. There is a real valid place for the nuance of how loneliness impacts gender. And that's a really, really interesting point here. And what I'm hearing through everybody's answers so far, and we're going to come next to Amy to see what the Marmalade Trust sort of position on this is. But what I'm hearing is that there's a massive lot of work that still needs to be done. Probably, I'm hearing, maybe reading between the lines, but you're the professionals here, in really accepting loneliness as a thing and tackling it head on, breaking it apart and saying this exists. We might not think about it in that sort of terms, but because we're not thinking about it, perhaps it's not being addressed as directly as it could be. Amy, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I guess kind of going back to the original question, and I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. I think there's something around employers missing the signs here and sort of seeing that maybe their workforce haven't got the right work ethic, or maybe they just haven't really got, there's a bit of low morale, maybe there's just a lack of well-being. And certainly what we hear is when HR managers come to us and they say, we've tried lots of different things. And so I'll give some examples of an organisation who came to us and said, we've done our surveys, we know everyone's sort of morale is a bit low, we don't really know what's going on, so we put a big budget in, and we've put in shared lunches, and we had them all out, and we expected everybody to go and sit and share their lunch, but everyone went and took the lunch and took it to their desk. We put in, like Pippa was saying, we put in yoga classes, but actually the yoga teacher just stood there and no one went because the lack of connection within the workforce was so low. And we even had an example of an organisation saying that they bought a piano and they put it in the reception area thinking that people would go and play. But actually, when we asked the question, does anyone actually play piano? They hadn't actually considered, it's enforcing connection into your workforce is not really the right way around going it. You've got to make these really sort of low level intentional. You've got to be really intentional about it. Think about these low level moments of how you can create that connection. So what we do know is work's changed. I mean, we think back to pre-pandemic and we were in the office 9 to 5, and this phrase of the water cooler moments where you would just have the points where you stood and make coffee, you waited outside meeting rooms and chatted, you just connected throughout the day in these micro levels. And now that work is very different. A lot of us work hybrid, some work mainly from home. So actually, how can organizations really consider what their workplace is like, and how they're making and creating spaces for connection?
It's incredible, isn't it? That at the core of this is something really simple and human, and that's that the human species, are a social, sentient species. We need connection, and actually, we are navigating a really through, I guess, forced external forces. We're navigating a really rocky time that we've not really, as a species, ever experienced before. That is impacting and perhaps exacerbating senses of loneliness in the workplace. I can't believe how well we are chomping through time, because this could honestly be like a 2-hour workshop / seminar thing. And if you're listening and you've got sponsorship and you think this would be valuable, I think you should get in touch with the Marmalade Trust, because I think it would be incredible. Listen, let's move on to a second question. Loneliness is often seen as a personal issue. I think that's quite a confident statement to make. But what responsibility do employers actually have when, if you think about it, connection and culture and a sense of belonging are often shaped by the physical work we do at work? Nick, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think employers have a significant responsibility, because work shapes many of the conditions that either enable or prevent connection. Most of us spend a huge proportion of our time at work. Our research shows that 80% of people look to work as a source of connection, but the organizational environment influences conditions like psychological safety, relationships with managers, access to networks, opportunities for collaboration, trust, a shared sense of purpose. And employees can't guarantee that every employee will never feel lonely, but they can create the conditions that make that type of connection more likely. And it's similar to how we think about physical health and psychological health. We also need to think about social health, which I think is a really helpful concept that needs to become more mainstream. And actually, if we start to frame it in that positive way, I think it can make a big difference.
That's a really interesting point. Amy, I want to come to you next on this, because actually the Marmalade Trust do have and do work with employers with corporate training services to help them understand and tackle the notion of loneliness. So what are your thoughts about this idea of employers actually having a bit more of a responsibility they might not be aware of because of the workplace potentially impacting loneliness?
I mean, absolutely. And just to echo what Nick said, the average person spends 13 years of their life in work. The organisations, employers do have a responsibility. And I think it's not only a responsibility to help formulate moments of connection, but it's a responsibility to make sure they're not harming those moments of connection. And actually, workplaces, like we're saying, workplaces have really changed and things have become quite fast paced, quite back to back. And actually finding those moments where you can have that intentional time of connection is just really important. So yeah, I think employers definitely do have a responsibility here.
Pippa, you obviously work with a lot of employees. You have a huge network and reach there. What are your thoughts here?
I think that again, just sort of echoing what both Amy and Nick have said, I think that the employer most definitely does have responsibility for how how connected their employees are feeling. I think a lot of the time there is also there's a generational side as well. We've got multiple generations that are within the same workplace. So I think that one of the major things that I found is specifically in smaller businesses actually, where a younger person's come into that business and everybody else is significantly older, going through different life challenges. They don't want to go out. They don't have time to go out. They can't go out after work. And also they're a bit stressed in their lunch breaks. And what ends up happening is that younger person feels very isolated. So I think that it is up to the line manager ultimately to find ways to help them feel more connected. And again, whether that's helping them to come to organizations like mine, quite a few employers, you go into your onboarding meetings, and join the City Girl Network is actually on that radar, because we do offer that sort of additional social connection. And obviously social health is enormously important, as Nick said, because it's not always about we're going to provide all your social connections within the workplace. It's also just showcasing that here are the other things that are available outside, and we support what you're doing with that as well. So it's more about awareness. You can't solve all of the issues, particularly small businesses. If you don't, it's hard to work with different people that perhaps you don't share the same life experience with. But you still do need to be aware of where the fall down might happen. And if you are starting to spot people say, oh, I didn't really think that person would listen to me over that, or I didn't really think that, I didn't think that I was needed in that meeting, that is some serious warning signs of that person's feeling very isolated, and that you need to step in. And I suppose the best way of doing it is do a social health audit. What are the ways that person is connecting themselves in the workplace and outside of the workplace, and how can you just help that wider sense of belonging? That's sort of what I found the most successful employers do.
Thank you. Emmaline, I'm going to come to you because you are the employer. So it's interesting to hear from your perspective.
I am representing the employer.
Yes. Apparently, there's a lot of responsibility that's being landed at your door now, Emmaline. So what's your take on this?
I mean, fundamentally, every day we make an impact on how people experience the workplace, right? The everyday decisions that we make are fundamental to whether someone feels belonging or not, right? And so I think on a very basic, what is the responsibility? Having the strong fundamentals in place, like the right policies and the well-being and the opportunities and inclusion. But going beyond that, actually, for me, what makes loneliness so pernicious is also what makes it so powerful, right? There is also an opportunity to unlock here, which is when we don't see it just as a line manager responsibility or a leadership responsibility to create the culture. The culture is created by the people that are within the organization. And so, making sure that we are a loneliness aware employer and that we're empowering people with the skills and the knowledge to be able to recognize loneliness in themselves, but also in others, then everyone can feel empowered to, take an action. And that small moment of connection is so powerful. And there's an opportunity to unlock here, right? Because it's about social health at work, but alongside that, at Heineken, we've also prioritized purpose, as well as physical and mental and social health. So, I think there's definitely a big opportunity here. And obviously that estimated cost to employers of 2.5 billion a year, there's a business case as well. So I think it's about the responsibility, but also the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. Great answers, everybody. For context, and just to add something here, 23 and a bit years I've worked as a behaviour insight advisor for many organisations over the world, 93 of the Fortune 100, as well as lots of smaller ones. And there's 2 points that I want to pull out here that are so important. One is about red flags that Pippa said, and actually the better we are at spotting red flags, part of that is about holding a mirror up to ourselves as an organisation and as leaders and managers to say, actually, maybe this is more about me. Maybe it's not just blaming everyone else, but am I doing the right things? Am I noticing the red flags is really important. And actually, to Emmeline's point there, that actually it's the small incremental changes that often can create the most dramatic consequences and most dramatic effects. It's not about radically putting in a loneliness, routes or campaigns, but it's what small changes can we make. Listen, we're rapidly running out of time. I'd love this conversation to go on for hours. I think we've got so much to uncover. Thank you for your messages in the chat. I'm going to come to each of our panelists, and what I would love you to do is try and stick to 60 seconds. As I'm going to push you on like a really short, quick answer. The question is simple. What does meaningful action look like in practice? We've spoken a little bit about awareness days, wellbeing statements has kind of been touched on, and policy, and obviously we've got social events like this. But some questions that have come through the chat really are about simple tips. Just give me the how, especially for managers. So what is some meaningful action that people can do that will have immediate impact? Emmaline, we've just come to you, so I'm going to stick with you for a second from a workplace environment. You clearly, Heineken, are doing a lot with this. What have you learned? Give me a kind of 60-second rundown that people can take away.
I'll try. So first of all, the passion from our colleagues has been absolutely incredible. What we've been able to achieve over the years, from our Hereford team hosting coffee mornings in, local pubs, to our, fundraising efforts and our star pubs turning orange. It's about really that empowering our colleagues to be the agents of change, right? And creating that then ripple effect they can take into wider society. Importantly, though, this is about leading from the top. And as Amy knows, and Nick as well, that our most senior leaders are deeply involved in this and advocates. They share their own personal experiences with loneliness. And I think that is a powerful message and moves me at least to tears. So I would also just say, back to my original point, meaningful action is a year round. It's not a campaign. It's not just about Loneliness Awareness Week, whilst it's brilliant to be here on the 10th anniversary. It's about the ongoing drumbeat. Make sure that it's embedded, so it doesn't feel like another action on the to-do list, and create a grassroots movement that everyone can feel empowered and inspired.
Great foundations. Thank you, Emmaline. Amy, let's come to you. What are those simple tips for meaningful action from the Marmalade Trust?
Well, I'm just going to quickly fire through some things that we use in our organisation, which might be helpful for people. So one of the things that we do is we do body doubling, where we have somebody else that's on the screen. This is really helpful when people are working from home. So you just have somebody else that's there, and then you have a task that starts at the beginning, and you have that moments of kind of connection, so you can just feel connected with someone else in the room. Again, it's as Emmaline talked about, it's about making these these regular things within the designing it into the workplace, having that knowledge. So other things like starting meetings with 2-minute check-ins with other people, not having these kind of enforced icebreakers, but really just trying to get a sense of connection and belonging with people. We've all moved very much over to just emailing constantly. We don't pick the phone up anymore, but actually phone your colleague, just actually, you know, rather than messaging on Slack or whatever other channels, actually just pick up the phone and have a conversation. Anchor days are really important. If you're an employer and you've got days where people are at home on different times, actually having an anchor day, a day that everybody is in the office. I remember just after the pandemic speaking to an organisation that had brought people back to the office after a lockdown in A to Z order, and they contacted and said, God, something's really wrong, and we know they've been through a really challenging time. But when we spoke to them about it, people with their initial A to E weren't necessarily friends, so they sort of slotted people out without consideration for where those groups and pockets of friendships are, really kind of valuing those friendships and allowing people, giving permission as leaders to say, well, actually this chat is actually part of someone's well-being and connection, encouraging regular lunch breaks, really designing into the physical space as well. Have you got moments and places to linger? We've become so efficient within the office environment, but actually just standing and washing up together is a moment for connection, you know, rather than having a dishwasher.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Pippa, your quick 60-second rundown of meaningful action, some simple tips for people to take away?
So absolutely all in there with the micro moments, and definitely what Amy and Emmaline have already said. I'll sort of skip past those because I agree with all of those. I think that doing a social health audit of everybody in your organisation and understanding what their interests are, finding that common thread is also something really important, particularly if you're doing charity initiatives. Make sure that they're charities that really reflect your whole organisation, rather than just the people that are actually at the top, because then you're going to encourage more people to get involved. I think I just want to also really echo what Amy said about giving people the permission to be social, and that it's not all about being effective all the time, because ultimately in the end the more social your workplace is, the happier, the more sort of connected they feel, the longer they stay, the more money you save, and the better the work's going to be. So it's really just recognizing those micro moments, those opportunities for everybody to connect. It's not all about alcohol as well. I think that's also something quite important to say. So again, just finding those common threads, that common interest, and really sort of pushing those into the right direction. That's what I would say.
Perfect. Thanks, Pippa. And Nick, pushing you for your very quick 60-second simple tips, if you have any from that, I guess, slightly more academic space that you're in.
Well, yeah, actually, most of it's been covered already brilliantly. So I thought I'd just share a couple of great examples that we've come across. So Airbnb, for example, totally redesigned, rethought their workspace. They're a very disruptive company, and they've applied that to their internal operations as well. So one example was they tried to design their offices like a neighborhood style, so no set desks or team locations, communal kitchens, social spaces, and then it meant that chance encounters are kind of designed into the workplace itself, to stop that siloing and encourage social connection. So really interesting there. Another cool example is from KPMG. They have roles called connection champions. So they find people that are really sociable and outgoing already, and then they offer them a role to welcome newcomers, facilitate introductions, host informal gatherings, and notice isolation appearing at an early stage.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We're at 9:30. That is what an incredible day. I will say we've had some incredible questions and some useful pointers as well. I thought we would get through a ton more stuff today. I secretly knew we'd probably only have time for 3 questions, but I am delighted with the content we've had. Clearly, this is a conversation that needs to happen perhaps a lot more regularly and would be beneficial for everybody. So maybe we should all look into how that can happen. But of course, it's difficult because everybody's time is very precious. So 30 minutes, I think, is a great sweet spot. But I wonder if we could commit to this and open this conversation up again. One of the key themes I think we've heard today is that loneliness at work is often hidden. But the workplaces also have a real opportunity to shape connection and belonging and everyday culture in meaningful ways. Awareness is important, but meaningful action often comes through the small practical changes, whether that's how people are welcomed or managed, supported, or simply included day to day. And that is irrelevant of gender, actually. There are nuances that we've spoken about that we need to think about gender, but loneliness isn't just something any one individual or organization can solve alone. So creating more connected workplaces is something we've all got a role in. Loneliness is the red flag that we've spoken about, the catalyst for mental health, depression, confidence, and effectiveness for our ability to flourish as human beings, not just in the workplace. Marmalade Trust also have incredible additional workplace resources and training for organizations if you want to continue these conversations internally and better understand how to support connection and belonging within your teams. I have to thank everyone for joining us this morning. You at home, our panelists as well, for such an insightful discussion. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great Thursday. Be kind to yourself and each other. And I hope we get to do this again very soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.